Hi guys, this is Lucietta Park, and in this video I'll be talking about the parts of speech in the Korean language, and I will also be listing out a few differences between the Korean language and the English language. I get it that everybody knows what parts of speech are. Everybody also knows this, that there exist a lot of differences between any two languages spoken on earth, right? But the fact is they don't actually know what are these differences, right? And this video is going to help you with that. And secondly, what I wanted to say is that I'm really sorry to you guys because I have not uploaded in such a long time, and I guess I won't be uploading really soon because I'm having a lot of tests right now, and being honest, they're not gonna end soon. They have a few more months to go, and then you know what I mean, right? And third thing that I wanted to tell you guys is that I'm giving two big announcements at the end of this video about my upcoming content, so please keep on watching for that. So the first part of speech that we're gonna talk about right now are nouns. Alright, so nouns, for people who don't know, firstly, nouns are basically names, alright? Names of people, places, things, objects, etc, etc. Alright, and that's kind of the basic overview of what nouns are. And now let's focus on to the differences. First difference between Korean nouns and English nouns is that Korean nouns do not have a specific gender, nor do they have a specific number. Alright, so if you want to use a singular version of a noun at a certain place, and then if you want to use the plural version of a noun, the same noun at some place, then in English you have the specific two versions for those two areas, right? And in Korean you have to use the same noun for both the places. And secondly, for the fact that nouns do not have any gender, basically what I'm trying to say is that Korean verbs are not conjugated, or they just do not change their forms according to the gender or the number of the noun, because the gender or the number of the noun simply does not exist in the Korean language. This whole discussion basically brings us to the fact that subject-verb agreement completely does not exist in the Korean language. And being honest, I think that even though it makes learning the Korean language a bit easier, I think that for some people, adjusting to this fact might take a bit of time, because English, firstly, the language which I'm talking in right now, English has a lot of there's a lot of importance of subject-verb agreement in the English language, right? And I think it might take a lot of time for complete beginners to adjust to this fact, but then again it makes the language easier, and then again you are learning the language, and if you really want to learn the language, then you have to learn to cooperate with that. What's that? The second difference between the Korean language and the English language is that of a really small percentage of the Korean nouns, there exist more than just one version, specifically 2 or 3 versions, because it's kind of weird to explain. Actually, there are 3 formality levels in Korean, and which is big difference from English. So there are 3 formality levels in Korean. One is at the extremes of casualness, and we use this level to talk to younger people, like your younger sister, your younger brother, or somebody who is really close to you, like sometimes your parents, sometimes your even older brother sometimes, and you know what I mean, your best friends, and so on. And then we have the one which is at the extremes of formalness, alright? And we use this one at workplaces. So even if you're really close with a person and he is your co-worker, and if you want to talk to him at your working place or your office, then you have to use this version. Whereas if you're in a normal environment, in a park, hanging out or something, then you use this version, alright? And it's just this level, it's just like reserved to people of really high respect, like somebody you have to give a lot of respect to. And then comes the one which we just left out, which is like which sits completely like perfectly in the middle of the other two, and we use this to converse with someone who you are not really close to. And this version is usually the perfect one to talk with strangers, like somebody who you see around at the park, somebody who you don't know, and like at a shop, if you're asking something, if you're asking for juice, then you talk to the shopkeeper with this formality level. Alright, and that's the basic overview of what formality levels are, and yeah, that's basically it. So because of these formality levels, there exist more than a few versions of the same noun because of the different formality levels, obviously. So basically what I wanted to say is that it's completely okay if you wanna like just continue with the most frequently used version of the same noun, of the one noun that you're learning right now, and then learn the other versions of the same noun later on. And being honest, that's what I honestly do. And secondly, it's also completely okay to know all of them and learn all the three versions of the same noun. And it's just completely okay to use both methods when learning nouns or remembering them or memorizing them. But what I'm trying to basically say is that just do not like stop learning Korean because of this teeny tiny thing, because firstly, subject verb agreement does not exist, and there are a lot more advantages of learning Korean than there are disadvantages. So the second part of speech that I was going to talk about right now actually is an exception, or maybe a difference between Korean and English in its whole self, because the concept of that thing, that part of speech completely does not exist in the English language. Alright, so the thing or the part of speech that I'm talking about right now are particles. Alright, so particles, to be honest, I think they cannot be explained just in one sentence, but let me try. So particles are basically attachments, and that's the best thing that I can say. So particles are basically attachments which are basically obviously like attached to a certain part of the sentence, and there are a lot of different particles, and every particle has its own duty, right? So if the subject marking particle is attached to somewhere, it marks the noun or the phrase or whatever it is attached to as the subject of the sentence. Alright, and there are a lot more particles like that, and some follow like different, I don't know what I'm saying. It's just that there are a lot of particles and everybody has its own duty. Every particle has its own duty. So I guess it's gonna be a long video if I were to explain all the duties of every particle that existed. So I guess I'm leaving it for another video. And so basically I actually have something that I wanted to say about this part of speech. Alright, so there are actually two things, and the first thing basically is that sometimes the particles behave, I don't know, they just work, or maybe they just do the work of other parts of speech sometimes. So let me just explain that to you with an example. So let us take the example of the word and. A and D. And is a conjunction, right? It basically joins two clauses, or basically two things. Alright? Basically two words, nouns, whatever. Right? So that's just how it is in English. We just have one word for and in Korean we actually have two ways to use the and nuance, or whatever you wanna call it. So the first one is to use just the word for and. Word for and, it's just a complete word, and it's just like we write a clause and then we use and then like the verb for and then we use another clause and then end of the sentence, right? And then we have like the second version, which is actually the particle, right? So particle, like there are a few particles, like more than a few, for the use of and, which have the duties of joining two things, right, in the and nuance, like in a positive attitude, in a positive nuance. So that's just basically how it is. So they just take, like they work differently, and they are actually attached to the clauses instead of just staying there separately as a complete word, but they do the work which was supposed to be done by the other version of writing the and. I mean, this might sound a bit weird because I'm not actually teaching right now, I'm just stating out the differences and some facts about the words, like parts of speech. So let's move on from that. So the second fact that I wanted to tell you guys is that sometimes at certain contexts, like at those times, certain particles are omitted in spoken language, whereas they are always written in the written language. Now let's talk about the third part of speech, which is verbs. Alright, so verbs in Korean can be pretty weird and a bit difficult for beginners, because verbs in Korean are actually firstly conjugated according to the formality levels in Korean. Alright, so verbs in Korean are conjugated according to the formality levels in Korean, besides like conjugating according to like the normal other languages, like the tenses, right? And then they are also conjugated according to some other nuances. So if you want to conjugate a verb, and if you want to actually give it a certain nuance, like if you want to say that you are really excited, or maybe something you didn't know, right? So there's a different verb ending for it, and verb ending is something that I'm going to be describing a bit later on in the video. So firstly, let's talk about the three forms of verbs of a verb in Korean. So basically, the first form of a verb in Korean is the dictionary form of the verb, right? So dictionary form of the verb is basically, like, obviously you can see from the context, when you're trying to find a verb in a dictionary form, like it will be always be found in the dictionary form of the verb. Then we have to move on to the second form of the verb, which is the verb stem. And there's something that you need to know, and that something is that every verb in Korean, literally every verb in Korean, ends with dha. And that dha version of the verb, which like the ending part is dha, then that verb is most likely in the dictionary form as well, because that's just it. Alright, there's no because. So that is the dictionary form of the verb, and to get the verb stem from the dictionary form of the verb, you simply have to erase the dha, and when you remove the dha, we just get the verb stem of the verb. Let me move on to the third version of the verb, or the third form of the verb, which is obviously the conjugated version of the verb, which I guess you already knew from the context. So basically, verbs in Korean are conjugated according to tenses and formality levels and nuances, right? So that's just it about verbs. Verb endings was something that I was supposed to tell you, right? So verb endings are basically like, to get to the conjugated version of the verb, we have to add a certain verb ending to the verb stem, and the conjugation of the verb completely depends on the verb ending, and the verb ending has different duties, it gives different nuances, tells us the time, and tells us the formality levels, etc, etc. Alright, and I'm going to explain that later in another video, because I don't want this video to be too long. And now let's jump into the fourth and the last part of speech that we're going to be discussing right now, which are adverbs. adjectives. Alright, so adjectives, being honest, the fact is that adjectives completely do not exist in the Korean language. And then again you might be thinking, why is the video so long? So the fact is, actually adjectives do exist in the Korean language, but they are not called adjectives. Obviously they're not called adjectives, they are called something else in the Korean language. But in English as well, they have made a few differences, changes. The Korean people do not call adjectives as adjectives, but they actually call it as descriptive verbs. Alright, and then again you might be thinking that descriptive verbs and adjectives are the same. What is the difference? Right, so the difference is that it basically just lies in the name itself. Right, so adjectives are basically words that describe something, right? But what are descriptive verbs? Descriptive verbs are verbs that describe something, right? So there is a teeny tiny difference, right? But when you are actually learning the Korean language, it becomes a really big difference. So this basically brings us to the fact that adjectives in Korean are actually verbs, but verbs which actually describe something. So that's just basically it, and it also brings us to the fact that the Korean adjectives, or maybe I should call them descriptive verbs, they are actually conjugated in two ways. So let me give you an example in English. So in this example we're gonna be talking about a car which is red. Alright, so we can say it in two ways. The first one is the car is red. Alright, and that becomes a complete sentence. But we can also say this same thing as red car. So this basically becomes a clause, or maybe just an adjective and a noun in English, right? But you might be thinking that how is Korean any different? I'm being honest, I actually said that wrong, and that's why I have to repeat this whole thing. So what I'm saying is that Korean as well, we have to use, we have two ways to conjugate an adjective or a descriptive verb. So basically the first way is by using the format of the car is red, right? If we are using that way to describe something, then we have to conjugate the adjective as a verb, right? So in that way we just use the same ways that we use to conjugate verbs. Alright, and then it also brings us to the fact that there are also three forms of the descriptive verbs, which are obviously really similar to the three forms of the verb. The first form of verb was dictionary form of the verb, which here gets converted into dictionary form of the adjective, and they both are the same, as adjectives or basically descriptive verbs are also the same. They are also always ending in dha, right? And then when you remove the dha, we get the descriptive verb stem. Alright, we can also call it the adjective. So then we have the third one, which is the conjugated version of the adjective, and this is basically the third form, and it also works the same as verbs. So there's one more difference that I wanted to tell you guys, and that difference is something that you might kinda already know. So let me tell that. So the thing is, adjectives cannot act on verbs in Korean as well as in English, whereas verbs can in both the languages as well. So that's just basically it. Adjectives cannot change the object, right? And they personally not. So they just basically do not have an object. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that we cannot use the object marking particle with an adjective which is being conjugated as a verb. Alright, so that's basically it. Object marking particle, for those who don't know, object marking particle is basically a type of particle which is attached to a certain noun to mark it as the object of the sentence. Alright, that's just basically it. And if you have focused and paid attention to what I was saying, I guess and I think that you know that I've only explained the one and first version basically of conjugating adjectives, whereas there's like actually two versions, right? So the second version basically is really easy and it's just a verb ending, adjective ending I should say. So we just use the, I'm not teaching how to conjugate adjectives here, so I'm not really saying the particles and the verb endings out loud right now. So we just get the adjective stem and then we add the verb ending which is supposed to turn it, like conjugate it in that particular form, right? That's just basically it. Alright guys, so that was basically it for the video, I guess. And what I actually wanted to say about the two announcements is that firstly what I wanted to say is that I'm actually starting a new beginner series for people who have just learned Hangul, and I think that I'm gonna skip the Hangul part because I am not good at explaining the how the air comes out of your mouth and things like that. So it's just I don't know, I'm just not good at teaching it, and it's just that. And secondly, what I wanted to say is that I am starting, like, I'm giving an update to my channel, and the thing is that I'm actually gonna be like attaching a small piece of vocabulary chart and sheet to each video on Korean that I make on this channel, so that I can help you increase your vocabulary as well as increase mine. And I'm also gonna speak it at the end of the video, and I'm also gonna help you write it in both the ways, the normal computer type of written way and the cursive flowy natural way, which in which native Koreans write. And that is just it for the video. So bye bye, please subscribe.